Thank you. When I was 16, I asked one of my high school teachers, "What kind of music do you like to listen to?" He replied, "Classical," and I laughed in his face. I was ignorant and I assumed that classical music was a dinosaur that had nothing to offer our present. I believed in progress, and I thought discerning, sophisticated people listened to Motley Crue. I was blind to our cultural legacy, not to mention deaf and dumb. And then in college, my passion for science and mathematics gave way to music and philosophy. Philosophy, simply because I had so many questions about life. And I discovered that each of the sub-disciplines of philosophy deals with one central question. For example, the central question of ethics is, why be good? The central question of the philosophy of science is, how do we know? The central question of epistemology, or the study of knowledge, is how do we know we know? And then, for me as an artist, the central question of aesthetics, up until about a century ago, used to be what is beautiful, but for me it became what is good. And that's what I'd like to concentrate on now. And there's another central question that I believe we need to think about as a culture, and that is this: our cultural legacy. What are we leaving behind? There's a lot of talk nowadays about leaving behind massive amounts of debt to as yet unborn generations. We're also leaving behind environmental destruction. There's a lot of talk about that as well. Yet, what will survive? Now, when cultural anthropologists examine a particular culture, they look at several aspects. Some of the things that they look at are a culture's technology, its art, mythology, which is to say any stories, its political system, and other ones. But I'd like to concentrate on two of these for now: technology and art. We're dealing with a big question today with the topic of insanity. Is technology truly progress, or to what extent is technology progress? As we know all too well, technology will always be superseded. We send powerful satellites into outer space to photograph the origin of the universe rather than erecting stone circles. Your cell phone today has more power than yesterday's room-sized supercomputer. And for that matter, nobody wants the iPhone 4 anymore. And I guess we could add the iPad 3 to that list now. Yet, when anthropologists examine a culture, it really is the art that has permanent value. It's art, arguably, that gives a culture immortality. And I found a beautiful quote by one of the early US presidents, John Quincy Adams. "I must study politics and war, that my sons may study mathematics and philosophy, in order to give their children the right to study painting, poetry, music, and architecture." Art, therefore, is arguably a culture's truest legacy. But why art? Isn't it all just apples and oranges? Isn't it all merely relative, purely subjective? Let's talk a little bit about art and science. Now, what's something called the subject-object dichotomy has been the central philosophical problem in the philosophy of science as well as in aesthetics for as long as they've been around. Now, seemingly, science, aesthetics, art, they represent opposite poles, don't they? We tend to think of them as oppositional. I'd like to suggest that they're really dialectical. Now, art is about what makes us human, but so is science. Art is more about the senses and the emotions, subjectivity, while science is about logic and reason, objectivity. And yet, in reality, there's a spectrum that ranges from pure subjectivity to pure objectivity. Now, science aspires to pure objectivity, yet neither art nor science is really at either extreme. Scientists are, after all, subjects. Let's talk a little bit more about subjectivity and taste, art. Taste is by definition subjective. It's individual, it's personal, it's relative. It's the very antithesis of knowledge. I feel and I like are perfectly unscientific statements. They have zero truth value because they're purely subjective and untestable. And yet, how do we know stuff? We know it primarily through two ways, the senses. We have our 5 senses. This is how we experience the world. By definition, these are purely subjective. And then on the other side, we have logic and reason. This is the objective part. These happen to correspond to 2 parts of the brain. And the mind is perpetually at war with itself. For example, sometimes what we seem to experience isn't really real. Take dreams, for instance. The senses, therefore, are deceptive. Here's a very simple anecdote to illustrate that point. When I was a little kid, my siblings and I used to beg our grandmother to make us our favorite cake, and it was her specialty. It was called red velvet cake, and it was so much better than her chocolate cake until we realized only years later that it actually was her chocolate cake recipe but with red dye added. Now, isn't it interesting that we use one of the 5 senses, namely taste, to talk not only about food, but also about aesthetics? Let me introduce another example to illustrate this point. The musicological coup of the last century, according to the eminent music scholar H.C. Robbins Landon, was the discovery of 6 of the 7 lost piano sonatas by Joseph Haydn. And this happened in 1993, was the discovery. These were written in the 1760s, but they never made their way to a publisher, unfortunately. Apparently Haydn gave them to students and they got lost. Composers at the time did not have cloud storage. And there was a world premiere that was set up of these 6 sonatas at Harvard University. And the premiere was to be played by my teacher and mentor here in Vienna, Paul Badura-Skoda, who just celebrated his 85th birthday. And then word got out that it was a big practical joke. It was all a hoax by a German composer, a living composer, by the name of Winfried Michel. But this story leads us to an essential question about aesthetic taste. Is this good music? After all, the music itself is exactly the same whether it was written by some famous composer 250 years ago or whether it was written by somebody alive today. Even the music historian Robbins Landon said that if this guy really is a fraud, then we've got to drag him to London and get him to produce more. Yet why do we value Haydn's music so highly and the fraudsters not at all? After all, it requires great skill to compose in either case. But the answer is that we value originality. Originality requires more skill. It's therefore a greater accomplishment. Creativity, originality, these are considered marks of good taste in our culture. We pan works that we consider derivative, and we consider creativity fundamental to artistry. So in art, rather than survival of the fittest, it's generally the most accomplished artworks, the greatest contributions that will survive. Now, at this point, we've asked ourselves about our culture's legacy. What are we leaving behind? We've compared art and science, subjectivity and objectivity, and we've explored what's valuable in art and culture. Now let's explore for a moment just how subjective art really is. Is art merely subjective? Is there an objective basis for our aesthetic tastes? Now, just as physical taste is necessary for individual survival, we know, for example, that all organisms and animals need to find nutritious food to survive. Not only that, the physical sense of taste can warn of impending danger. For example, a plant that is bitter might be poisonous. But just as physical taste is necessary for individual survival, I believe that aesthetic taste is necessary for cultural survival. And this is what we truly need to think about as a society, our cultural legacy. What will contribute not only to our present culture, but to future cultures as well? We live in an age in which artworks have become products just like any other. Artworks are now often consumables with limited shelf life, and we even use the term consuming content. But think about this. What of today will outlive us? What are the masterpieces of today? Now, on the subject of subjectivity and objectivity, what else does science have to offer aesthetics? I'd like to introduce a biological principle that's also relevant to art. Now, whether it's an organism's design, that it's the result of natural evolution, or it's an artwork, or even the design of a successful product, the principle is the same. And that principle is this: complexity. But importantly, it's not just complexity for complexity's sake, it's irreducible complexity. Einstein said, everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. Actually, that's a paraphrase. What Einstein really said was, it can scarcely be denied that the supreme goal of all theory is to make the irreducible basic elements as simple and as few as possible without having to surrender the adequate representation of a single datum of experience. Right, thanks. I almost did that in one breath. But it turns out this principle of irreducible complexity is both a biological and an aesthetic principle. It's biological because evolution moves towards greater complexity. And we even make ethical decisions based on an organism's complexity. Now, this happens to be guided by our anthropomorphic prejudice. In other words, the closer an organism is to us, then the higher we judge it. For example, we think nothing of squashing an ant or swatting a fly. Got it. But we compare that to animal testing versus eating animals. Some people are vegetarians for ethical reasons, or the entire abortion debate hinges upon this issue of complexity, the complexity of the organism. It's one important aspect. Turns out we also err in our judgment. We have less chromosomes than a potato. Potatoes have 48, we have 46. And when the environment changes sufficiently, animals over time are left with what are called vestigial organs. Vestigial organs, these are non-functional remnants of past organs that once had a purpose. And we even make this decision ourselves as humans. We remove tonsils, we remove wisdom teeth or an appendix, etc. And yet, this idea of complexity, but not too much complexity, just enough, irreducible complexity, is also an aesthetic principle. Everything in an artwork, ideally, has a purpose, and that purpose is expression. This is also the case for design, for product design. Steve Jobs famously became furious when he saw the first iMac, and it had an eject button. He went ballistic. So the goal then is not the greatest complexity, but rather only that which is necessary for the most effective expression. So there's a certain principle of economy at work. And I'll use one simple example that everybody should know to illustrate. And this is an example then of economy in expression. Less is sometimes more. Most people here have probably seen Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece, Psycho. Right? Has anybody not seen it? Okay, a few people, but most people have seen it. Everybody knows about the famous shower scene, right? This is considered by film critics to be, by many of them, to be the best, hands down, most effective murder scene in film history. And yet, how does it work? What's interesting is that Hitchcock deliberately filmed Psycho in black and white, even though this was the 1960s already. He didn't want to show red blood on a camera. He thought that would be too shocking. And not only that, we never see the knife actually striking flesh. We never really see the murder taking place. We hear some shocking music. We see the motions of the murderer, but then afterwards, we don't yet see the body even. It's all off camera. What does the camera do? The camera simply, slowly pans down. The shower is still running. It's very slow. And eventually it focuses on the drain, and we see and hear only the water and then that trickle of blood. And that's it. And that is what makes it so effective. So it's actually, again, this principle of irreducible complexity. He found a minimum amount that will create the maximum effectiveness. And this then is a principle in aesthetics and art, but also in design. Now, in conclusion, we need to give much more thought to our legacy. We live in an era of exponential technological growth, of rapid product cycles, and we need to think more and more about what really makes us human. And more than that, we need to think hard about our culture's legacy in history. You see, we have a responsibility, and a lot of people are talking about that. But our responsibility is not only to the future, it's also to the past. And unless and until we fully understand the extent to which we're the benefactors of past generations and cultures, we won't understand how important we can be to future generations. Further, we can't teach our children unless we know it ourselves. This is our responsibility to the past and the future in art as well as science. The rest is a matter of taste. Thank you. Thanks.